Thanks so much for joining us today, Agnes.
Thanks for having me.
Maybe you can start off by just telling us a little bit about your own egg freezing journey. Why did you decide to freeze in the first place and what was it like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I froze my eggs when I was 36 years old, and I will date myself now and tell you that that was about 7 years ago. So I feel like I was sort of at the beginning to the kind of build up of more and more women starting to freeze their eggs. I actually decided to freeze my eggs because I was in my mid to late 30s and I was just coming out of a marriage. And in my first marriage, we spent probably about a year of a 3-year marriage trying to get pregnant. And I was young and healthy, and it just wasn't happening for us very easily. We went through some fertility treatments. We went through what I call fertility treatment light. So I didn't actually do any IVF, but we did start to go through just some of the kind of early interventions and some of the drugs to help stimulate my ovaries and then IUI. And then at the point where my doctor was ready to move me up to IVF, we actually decided to sort of pause on the marriage. And when we decided to actually divorce, I realized, okay, now I'm getting into my late 30s. It was difficult trying to get pregnant. So it's not as easy as I had always thought it would be. And so I need to take control of my fertility and do something about that. And so I decided to freeze my eggs. The actual egg freezing process for me was really interesting because I think I had a huge aha when I started going through the fertility treatments with my ex-husband. And then when I started to go through the egg freezing process, and that is that for so many years, I think less so now, but at the time, I think every woman assumed that you can have babies whenever you want. I think now people are a lot more open about IVF and donor eggs and all the different tricks we use to get pregnant when we're older. But back then there wasn't a lot of conversation about it. And I wanted to raise awareness around the fact that you can have children at almost any age, but that it requires potentially some serious intervention. And so when I went through my egg freezing journey, I decided to record it all. I started a blog about it and just started to kind of raise awareness for women who were about my age or younger, that you shouldn't take your fertility for granted and you should probably start proactively preparing.
One of the things that we often find people ask is sort of, what can you expect, or were there any surprises along the way when you actually went through the process of egg freezing?
Probably the biggest surprise for me was that it was relatively easy and it didn't take very long. I think I had anticipated it so much and was, quite anxious about the shots and all the things that you get really anxious about. And then once I was going through the process, I was like, oh, this isn't so bad. The shots aren't so bad once you can get over the psychology of poking yourself. And that really the whole cycle of freezing your eggs is maybe a week and a half, 2 weeks at most. I also learned so much more about how our cycles work because you're kind of like dissecting what happens day by day. So I got a great education into what a cycle actually means and what happens at every point in the cycle. And that egg freezing is actually just manipulating the first half of your cycle. So it's just about making sure that you're recruiting a lot of eggs, trying to get them as mature as possible, and then intervening at the point where you would be ovulating. And then from there on out, you kind of go through then you have your retrieval. And from there on out, it's just a regular cycle. And I wish I'd known this before I started. It would have saved me a lot of angst. As much as we get anxious about it and worry about it, it was actually a relatively painless, easy process.
So I'm curious, how did you feel afterwards? Emotionally, mentally, kind of, what did it do for you?
I think right afterwards, I felt a little bit like maybe I should have just completed an entire cycle and done IVF on my own, because I kind of felt like in my mid to late 30s, great, I have a bunch of frozen eggs, but what I really wanted at that point was a baby because my ex-husband and I were trying previously. And so it was mixed emotions, that I was happy that I froze my eggs, but that really I should have been trying to have a baby at that point in my life. I quickly got over that though. And ultimately the way I felt, whether consciously or subconsciously, is that my life could sort of go on for a while without me worrying and thinking about what's going to become of my fertility. So ultimately, I think it was a bit of a weight lifted off my shoulder. And then as I started to think about becoming a parent again, several years later, then I started to think about, what does this actually mean that I have these frozen eggs? Like they're being held hostage right now, really, because in order for me to use them, it costs boatloads of money. And so now I have to start thinking through the second part of this process. And ultimately, and we'll talk more about this, I didn't use my frozen eggs, and I did just recently have a baby. But I think, the overwhelming feeling that I had the years that followed my egg freezing is that I could kind of enjoy my life and not worry about what's going to become of my fertility.
Frozen your eggs, you feel like this weight is lifted off your shoulders, but then, sort of now what? As you mentioned, you now have a baby, but what was that process for you, and the decision process even around using your frozen eggs?
So it was a topsy-turvy process in that probably about 3 years ago now, I decided that when I turned 40, I would start to try and conceive on my own with donor sperm. And so when I turned 40, I did start the process of trying to conceive with donor sperm. And when I went to my doctors at that time, they encouraged me to use fresh eggs, so go through fresh cycles. And in fact, they didn't immediately put me on an IVF cycle. We just did 6 rounds of IUI because all my numbers were still good. I was still ovulating regularly, all that good stuff. And then I went through about 6 cycles of IUI, and nothing came of it. So I kind of went on pause.
Do you mind just giving me a little bit of background on what IUI is and kind of what that process was, if you're okay with talking about it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. IUI is basically 1 step, maybe 2 steps removed from IVF. It's basically artificial insemination. So IUI in a medical setting is that, they're tracking your ovulation. You may be on some sort of stimulants in order to make sure that you have the right amount of eggs, ideally 1 good egg every month. And then at the time that you are ovulating, you go in and you have artificial insemination.
When you decided to go it alone, what was your process around finding sperm?
Oh my gosh, that was such a weird, interesting, funny process. Well, I basically thought about 2 different things. One, obviously the health. And so you typically, especially if you're going it alone, you need to do a genetic screening. And so you go through the process of trying to figure out if you're a carrier for anything. And then if you are, you need to make sure that whoever you match up with isn't also a carrier of whatever that thing is. I was fortunate in that I'm not a carrier of anything. So I kind of had full access to whatever sperm I wanted. And then you go through the list of physical attributes, and you can see people's family history in terms of health. You learn whether they're smokers or not, things like that. So I kind of went through the process of picking out what was important to me. Obviously, I wanted to make sure that there were no major health issues in the family. And then I went through this really interesting process of what should the sperm donor look like, which sounds a little bit superficial, but when you're thinking about becoming a single mom, you have a lot of crazy different thoughts that you don't necessarily have. And not crazy, I shouldn't say crazy, but the thoughts that you don't have when you're doing it with a partner. And so one of the questions I asked myself is, if I pick someone who looks the opposite to me, and I tend to date men who don't look like me, they're typically darker hair, darker eyes. And so if I use that logic to pick donor sperm, then there's a chance that this child will come out looking nothing like me, which in a relationship is fine because he or she looks like dad. But when you're the only parent and when there is no father in the picture, I wanted to avoid a situation where people would say, oh, this baby must look just like his or her father, because it's just, you need to manage it a little bit differently. And at some point, you explain to the baby that we have a different kind of family that looks differently, and that it's not a mom and a dad, it's just a mom. And so I didn't want to invite any scrutiny or anything that would make that conversation awkward or difficult or any more challenging than it potentially could be. So I ultimately decided that actually, if I'm going to use donor sperm, that I wanted the donor to look a lot like me. So blonde hair, blue eyes, and healthy kind of became my go-to. So it's a relatively simple process. But after 6 months of trying and failing, it does become a bit emotionally trying. And at that time, I was starting a new job. So I decided I'm going to put this on hold and I'm going to revisit trying again once I'm sort of settled in this new role. And then I met someone. And even though I was mentally prepared to do it on my own, I was quite independent. I met someone, and not even a year later, we decided that we wanted to have a baby.
Where did you meet your partner?
It is kind of a fun story, and it's so cliche. They always say when you least expect it and when you're not looking is when it happens. We met through work, actually, and we worked on a project together, and that was that. And it moved very quickly. It's going to sound cheesy, but we met and fell in love almost immediately. And it was only a few months after we met that we started talking about trying to have a baby. And like I said, our 1-year anniversary that we started dating, I was already 4 months pregnant. So I think that's also the difference when you're in your 40s, is when you know, and you don't second guess and you don't question as much. And I got really lucky. And so we started trying. We went pretty quickly to IVF just because my doctor had been through the history with me of IUI. And so at this point, she was like, you guys want a baby, let's just get the show on the road.
How old were you at that stage?
I was 42. So that was basically about a year ago. Mm-hmm. So in early February of last year, I had my first IVF transfer, and the transfer is when they actually implant the embryos or transfer the embryos inside of you, and then you wait about a week and a half, 2 weeks, and cross your fingers and hope you're pregnant. And knock on wood, thank goodness, I got pregnant with the first IVF cycle, and I now have a 3-month-old. Who's adorable and well worth it. But I think what the assumption is, if people don't know me very well, is that I used my frozen eggs to get pregnant. And I did not. I went through a fresh cycle of IVF, and a fresh cycle just means that you basically harvest as many eggs as you can. You have a retrieval, so just the same thing as an egg freeze cycle. But then instead of being done with the cycle, after that, you start to give yourself more shots to basically mimic being pregnant. And then at a certain point in that cycle, they do the transfer, and then you wait and hope that you're pregnant. And so I decided to do a fresh cycle because, again, my doctor said, you're still healthy, you're still producing a lot of eggs. And should you guys want a second child, you then have all of these frozen eggs that you can tap into later. She calls them, they're like little diamonds. She's like, they're so valuable that if you can still produce your own healthy, fresh eggs, then you should do that rather than tapping into your frozen eggs. Now, she also said, if you know for sure that you just want one child and you'd rather just go that route, that's fine too. But we decided to go the fresh cycle.
Maybe you can kind of walk us through what your doctor counseled you on and kind of what how you kind of matched your family planning goals with your egg freezing cycle, and how that kind of, why that led you down the path of doing a fresh cycle versus using your frozen.
Yeah. So again, my doctor advised the fresh cycle because she knew that we probably did want to have a second child. And she also knew my history. She knew that I was still healthy and capable of producing a few good eggs and getting pregnant without using my frozen eggs. For me, the decision was more that I felt like we could go through a fresh cycle. And if that doesn't work, maybe we go through 2 fresh cycles. And if that doesn't work, then I have my frozen eggs. But what I didn't want to do is go directly to the frozen eggs, because I just wanted to sort of maximize my chances of getting pregnant. And I felt like I still could get pregnant without tapping into those eggs. And it was less about baby number 2, even though, we're definitely thinking about a second baby at some point. It was more just about making sure that this first pregnancy stuck. And so anything that I could do to improve those chances.
How did you find being pregnant over 40?
Pregnancy was fine. I think I had a very healthy pregnancy. I didn't have any issues with being pregnant over 40. It's just more about silly things like I threw my back out like 3 years ago, and I'm still in physical therapy and it's fine. But like, there are moments where I'm like, oh my God, putting this baby in and out of the crib and things like that. I'm like, I'm just an old lady now. But there were no real, physical issues that I had while I was pregnant. I think, the biggest sort of risk with waiting is the health of your eggs. Beyond that, if you're healthy, you can have a very healthy, easy pregnancy. When I was writing the book, I actually met a woman who had her first baby, and I think only baby still, at 50 or 55, which now doesn't even seem that crazy to me. But at the time that I was writing the book, I was like, oh my God. She used frozen eggs. And, she told me that the doctors and everyone kept anticipating a really difficult, challenging pregnancy. And she used to be a world-class athlete. So she's in great shape still. And she's like, my blood pressure was fine. They kept expecting that I would have blood pressure issues or gestational diabetes, and she had none of those things. So generally when you're healthy, the only risk is the health of your eggs. But assuming that you have healthy eggs and you get pregnant, the pregnancy should be as healthy as you are.
Has this whole process been hard alongside work?
Well, so there are 2 aspects to, I think, what can make it challenging and difficult. One is kind of the potential secrecy around it. And some women choose to keep it very private. And other women are much more open about it. And I personally felt that for me, well, first of all, I was blogging about it, and then I wrote a book about it. So I
wrote a book about it.
But I think part of what helped me work-wise is being so open and transparent. So I never felt like I had to hide it from anyone. And so that made any other conversation around missing work or whatever much more smooth. It was just easy. The second part is just the sort of logistics around managing a busy schedule and trying to get pregnant with treatments. I think ultimately it's not that difficult if you don't travel. If there's travel involved, I had to make sure that I was not traveling during the times that I was going through treatment. That was probably the extent of the difficulty that I faced. Beyond that, most of these fertility clinics, especially if you're in a big city, I'm in New York City, they know that we're doing this partly because we're busy women. And so most of the time, they see you for these daily treatments between like 6:30, 7 in the morning and 9 in the morning. So I basically got all the medical stuff out of the way before I even showed up to the office. And then it was just like another day at work. Like I said, the biggest challenge of it was back before COVID, when we were actually traveling for work, making sure that I kind of protected a couple of weeks out of the month where I wouldn't have to travel.
What did your doctor say about your chances of getting pregnant using your frozen eggs in the future?
Doctors don't always give you hard and fast answers, and so I can't give one either. I think it's always a little bit of it depends. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but at every age, there are statistics around what your chances are of actually carrying a baby to full term. And I think that in your mid 40s, getting pregnant naturally is something really dismal and low, like in the 10s or 20%. And then obviously those numbers go up and get higher as you get into IVF and treatment. So my doctor feels pretty confident that I can and will get pregnant again with my frozen embryos. But that's because I have history of conceiving and carrying a baby to full term. So it's a very kind of wonky doctory answer. But there are sort of hard and fast statistics that you can look up, and then your doctor may or may not give you statistics, but usually they like to say it depends.
Do you wish you had done anything differently?
Gosh, that's such a broad question as it relates to my fertility. No. No, I mean, I guess one of the things that I think about now that I have a 3-month-old is, why did I wait so long? And, you know, I think that, you know, for me, I have a career, I traveled a lot. I liked the life that I created for myself before having my baby. And while I wanted children, I also wanted to make sure that it was at the right time, either alone or with the right person. And so I never had any qualms about having my first child in my 40s. Now that I actually have a 3-month-old, I'm like, wow, this potentially would be easier if I was a little younger, just in terms of like, I don't know, I think younger parents take things into stride a bit more. And sometimes I just wonder why I didn't pull the trigger sooner. I applaud women that do it alone. Now that I have one, I'm like, oh my God, I don't know how people do it alone. And I'm even more in awe of women who have done it.
You have such an inspiring story. This whole topsy-turvy thing that is being a female. I know you are so busy. You have a newborn. You're in the process of buying a house. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
All right.
So
thank you. It was fun.